welcome to the Cradle's News Roundup, a weekly space where we will discuss the most important developments in West Asia and the world. As you all know, the Cradle is a geopolitical magazine based out of West Asia. My name is Esteban Carrillo. I am the head of news for the Cradle. Today I am joined by content creator and writer for the Cradle, Karim Shami, and by U.S. journalist William McWagonet. Today we're going to discuss a very interesting topic, and that is, what is the endgame for the war in Gaza, for the West, for Israel, and for the other players involved? Now, the war in Gaza is essentially at this point finishing its second month, entering the third month. With no sign of slowing down, Israel is bombing the south of Gaza indiscriminately. They are entering with tanks to Khan Yunis, Gaza's second largest city. People in Gaza have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The UN has said there is no safe place in Gaza. Even the shelters, UN shelters that are flying the UN flag, they are saying they are not safe. The UNICEF has said Gaza right now is the most dangerous place in the world for children. The death toll, the official death toll, stands around 16,000. But we know that there's thousands more that are still trapped under the rubble, bodies trapped under the rubble. And some rights groups have estimated that the actual death toll surpasses 20,000. So, in 2 months, about 20,000 dead, about 2 million displaced. No sign of slowing down, even with Western pressure. What is Israel said that they want out of this war?
Well, I think it's been pretty clear. In fact, there was a CNN story that just came out today where CNN said, according to U.S. officials, they said Israel's original plan after the Hamas terror attack involved an immediate large-scale land, air, and sea operation that would include the desire to level the entirety of the Gaza Strip. People familiar with their planning said. So, and that was just today, but we've had many indications of that. Obviously, Israel's behavior shows that, but then also there was the leaked report from the Ministry of Intelligence, Israeli Ministry of Intelligence, that talked about their plan to basically destroy Gaza, push all of its residents into the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt, where they would be housed in tent cities, and then the Israelis would just take over the Strip entirely and rebuild Jewish settlements there. For example, the Gush Katif settlement that was evacuated back in 2005. So it's pretty clear that's their plan. Also, I believe it was just last week, there was an Israeli minister named Ron Dermer, who's close with the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. He came up with a plan that talked about the need to thin out the population of Gaza and send people to other countries, including potentially forcing them to go to Egypt. If the Egyptians won't let them in, they can have them go through the tunnels between Egypt and the Sinai. Or he said also the sea is open to Palestinians, so they could potentially be allowed to flee on boats to Africa or to Europe. So I think it's really clear it's always been the classic, Zionist model, which is take land, steal land, ethnically cleanse the population, and then take it over for Jewish settlement. And that's what we're seeing in Gaza. Again, that's what happened in 1948, which is how the State of Israel was created. And we're seeing them just repeating the same tactics here, 75 years later.
Exactly, almost 8 decades of the same. But that's interesting because I think, evidence, everything that we have seen shows that this is the end game for the Israeli government, the Israeli army, is just to push out all the Palestinians, get rid of them. And because we have seen a lot of rhetoric over the past few weeks of Palestinian officials going and saying, why won't the West take the Palestinians? Why won't the Arabs take the Palestinians? And now this is to use the tunnels, to use the sea, to send them, where? What do you think, Karim, the Arab, the Arab world, how do you think they will respond to the mass displacement of 2 million people?
Al-Sisi, the president of Egypt, was clear that he will not be part of such plans. But we know that the president of Egypt usually changes his mind very fast. And this happened previously with Tiran and Sanafir, which was an island between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. When the news came out that Egypt will sell it, he acted as if he doesn't know what's happening. And then he sold it. He sold it, and it's a very important piece of land for Egypt, because in the 70s and in the 60s, during the wars between Egypt and Israel, this island was very, very important. And previously we saw in 2014 there was the Egyptian army was very active under the leadership of Sisi in bombing the borders between Israel and Gaza to prevent. He used to say they used to call it smuggling, but of course it was to prevent weapons or means of resistance equipment that enters the Gaza Strip. And this guy has a short in his short history, he always at the end agree what the West wants, or what the Gulf countries want. And as we see, Saudi Arabia wants to be like the UAE. That's what Mohammed bin Salman is trying to do, and he's following the footsteps of Mohammed bin Zayed, where he normalized with Israel. And now Mohammed bin Salman was taking these steps to normalize with Israel. And we all know that the Egyptian economy is very weak. It's very weak and fragile. And usually every now and then the UAE and Saudi Arabia put billions of dollars in the banks to stabilize their economy. So I think, unfortunately, I think Sisi at the end, if Israel succeeded and the only option was, "Khalas, we succeeded, and now we have to move them to Egypt," I don't think it's very far for Sisi to say no.
So you think these are just empty wars? Because it's been happening a lot, with the Gulf states and the other Arab states like Jordan, like Egypt, in which Turkey, that they issued these very strong border statements, like, oh, it will be a declaration of war. Turkey, I know it's not an Arab state, an Islamic nation. Erdogan is out here saying, oh, Netanyahu needs to be tried like the former leader of Yugoslav. And they say these things, but there's no action taken. Yeah. And I think because in the past week at the Cradle, we had a feature titled "Netanyahu's Endgame in Gaza is His Own Political Survival." And I think this is a very interesting topic to discuss, because we understand the Israeli, as a country, as a state, as a Zionist state, what is their endgame? Their endgame is to control this land, to build their settlements, and to establish their own country primarily for a Jewish population, or maybe only for a Jewish population. But Netanyahu seems to be kind of walking on his own way in a way, and using this for his own personal gain, because Netanyahu right now, he faces since 2019, I believe, he's been facing multiple corruption trials for bribery, for breach of trust, among other things. And now, before October 7th, he was already kind of on the tightrope, Netanyahu, no? He was already facing massive protests. He was facing, a mutiny from the reservists, the army reservists. And it's important to know that the Israeli army depends on the reservist force to conduct and to do what they're doing now in Gaza. They couldn't do it without the reservist force. So they were, essentially conducting mutiny, saying we will not go anymore to perform our duties. And this was all over the judicial overhaul that sought to essentially, in a nutshell, transfer the power of this High Court of Justice to the Knesset, which is run by Likud, Netanyahu's party, and in a coalition. And this, the first thing when they put forward, this was essentially their first measure when they came to power last December, was we're going to overhaul the judiciary. And everybody, when this happened, everybody knew, oh, he's trying to avoid a corruption trial. He's trying to avoid these things. But because this is also this thing that the Israeli opposition, like Yair Lapid, well, mainly him, Yair Lapid, has been saying Netanyahu needs to resign. Netanyahu needs to resign because he hasn't even, to this point, taken responsibility for what happened on 7 October. Other leaders in the Israeli government have. They have come out and said, once this is over, we essentially need to leave our posts. But Netanyahu, no. He's been blaming everyone but himself.
Well, we should say that as soon as Netanyahu came to power, again in December of last year, just about a year ago, again in this coalition of the religious settlers led by Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. He immediately did try to do the judicial overhaul, and that's what triggered these big protests against him that went on for months. But again, it should be emphasized that it was actually the United States was funding a lot of the NGOs that were organizing those protests. There were some reports that the Mossad was actually supporting the protests, and then
they allowed their employees.
They allowed their employees to attend, and then also there were a lot of calls, like in President Biden, he wouldn't invite Netanyahu to visit at the White House, even though he had just gotten elected, so it would have been custom to invite Netanyahu to the White House.
The first time in history, I believe that.
First time in history. And then there was prominent people in the U.S. media, including Thomas Friedland, writing for the New York Times, who were saying things like Netanyahu is the worst Israeli leader ever and that he should resign. So it's pretty clear that even the United States wanted to get rid of Netanyahu. And so he was in a very, very, precarious position, Netanyahu was, when the events of 7 October occurred, when Hamas did the surprise attack. And again, he's even under more criticism and even more unpopular now because people blame him for the intelligence failure that allowed the Hamas attack to be successful. And also they're blaming him for his treatment of the captives. So maybe we could talk about that too at some point. But
yeah, no, I think we can dive into it because, first let me mention something that the Financial Times had today, and to your point about the U.S., about the U.S. not inviting Netanyahu, for almost a year. The first time Biden sat down face-to-face with Netanyahu was at the UN General Assembly in September, which was 2-3 weeks before 7 October.
And then in New York, not
exactly, in only New York, and in a lobby, and then a few weeks later we see Biden, bother and essentially like Netanyahu, you're my best friend, where have you been all this time? And what I wanted to bring up is today as we record this, the Financial Times is citing Israel Hayom, that they released a recording of the Prime Minister saying in private that what Israel needs to destroy Hamas is a steady supply of U.S. bombs. It's a steady, and this also brings something that a retired general in the Israeli army said a few days ago, Yitzhak Brick, who was the ombudsman of the Israeli army. He said that the operations of the Israeli army depend on U.S. support, that without the support of the United States, what's happening in Gaza wouldn't be happening. And this is the same man that a few years ago said the Israeli army is not ready for war. We have become an Air Force army. And I believe we're seeing it that on the ground because we're seeing the carpet bombing of Gaza for about 60 days now. And on the ground they say they have made gains, but how they really? It's like there's different accounts of what's happening. We see Hamas, we see Qassam brigades, we see the Quds brigades. They're out there fighting. They're out there blowing up Israeli tanks. We discussed this last week when they said we control Gaza City. A few days later, Qassam comes out in a whole parade essentially, and to deliver the captives when the truce was in place. So to go back to what you were saying, Will, about the captives, we're seeing this massive bombing of Gaza while there's still Israelis inside, while there's still a number of Israeli captives. And I believe Netanyahu met with some of them yesterday or a few days ago, and things didn't really go his way.
Yeah, so there's just a report that came out today from Yedionot Ahronot. Hopefully I'm saying that right. Probably not.
Ynet.
Ynet, an Israeli newspaper, and it talked about this meeting between Netanyahu and the families of the Israeli captives that are being held in Gaza by Hamas and other factions. And it was, the main thing is the families were extremely angry at Netanyahu, but the reasons are really important. They were basically saying, look, our family members are in Gaza, either in homes or in tunnels, and they are more scared of dying from Israeli shelling than from Hamas. In fact, one quote was pretty shocking. One of the people that met with Netanyahu was a captive who had just been released. And she said, the feeling we had there was that no one was doing anything for us, The fact is, I was in a hiding place that was shelled by the Israeli army, and we had to be smuggled out while we were wounded. And then she says, not to mention the helicopter, the Israeli Apache helicopter that shot at us on the way to Gaza as she was being abducted. Then she says, you claim that there is intelligence, like about where the captives are being held. She's saying this to Netanyahu. But the fact is that we are being shelled. Then she says, my husband was separated from us 3 days before we were released, and he was taken to the tunnels underneath Gaza. And then she says to Netanyahu, and now you are talking about flooding the tunnels with seawater. And you are shelling the route, like the roads where the tunnels are located. So another captive, she said when that was released, she basically said, we were afraid that the Israeli shelling was going to kill us, and that then the Israeli government would claim that we had been killed by Hamas. So again, it's an indication of how unpopular Netanyahu is. It's an indication of how little they care about the captives. And, again, we've talked a lot in the past about the Hannibal Directive. Like, it wouldn't surprise me, and it does seem like literally the government would be happy just to kill the captives. And maybe that's why they're shelling the areas where they supposedly think these people are on purpose, hoping that they would just get killed and they wouldn't have to deal with that problem, and they could continue the war without this ongoing criticism from people within Israel saying, hey, we need to stop the war, we need a ceasefire because we need to get these captives out.
But there's also the other thing about this plan, to flood the tunnels underneath Gaza. And it's like there's warnings from humanitarian agencies, from the UN, who say, if you do this, you're going to create an even bigger disaster in Gaza. You're gonna contaminate even further the sources of water. And it's like already there's estimates that the death toll in Gaza from infectious diseases is going to be much higher than the death toll from the bombs being dropped. At this point, Gaza is an unlivable place. How can you sustain human life?
Yeah, I mean, to add to that, we saw a lot about Israel's campaign against hospitals in Gaza, including the Shifa hospital, where they had claimed that there was this massive Hamas headquarters underneath the hospital. And of course, there wasn't one. And the Israelis knew the whole time that there wasn't, and they tried to fabricate evidence suggesting that there was some Hamas headquarters below the hospital. But again, the reason that they wanted so badly to target the Shifa hospital and all the others is that they do want to make Gaza unlivable. And they want to, if they push Gazans out into these other countries, whether it be Egypt or elsewhere, they're trying to present it as if they will be doing that for humanitarian reasons. Like, Gazans, they have to leave because, look, it's so dangerous there. There's no services, like everything's collapsed. So, of course, it's the humanitarian thing to have them go to Africa or to Europe or anywhere, or to other Arab countries. And so again, that's the propaganda line that the Israelis are using. They're trying to make Gaza unlivable, whether through violence or just making the basic things that any society needs to survive, power, water, things like this, to totally destroy it.
The CNN had a report today, and I'll monitor as well, that says that the U.S. is pressuring Israel to finish their ground operation by January, like in a few weeks, essentially. Now, this completely flies in the face of what Israeli officials have been saying, which recently they had estimates that said this war is going to last at least a year. So what the U.S. is actually saying is that they want the ground operation to end as it is right now, and then maybe switch to a lower intensity, hyper-localized strategy that narrowly targets specific Hamas militants and leaders. This is the wording, when they say surgical strike and they go and bomb a hospital, they bomb a residential neighborhood. So why January? What's happening in January in the U.S.?
Well, I mean, I'm just speculating here, but the U.S. elections are coming up next year in November, of course, but the primaries and campaigning is really going to pick up at the beginning of the year.
And the U.S. is feeling the brunt from the international, from different countries, from their own population. There's even, threats within the Muslim American community to say no to Biden because of what he's doing.
Yeah, I was going to say in Michigan especially, there's a large Arab population that's sometimes viewed as a swing state. So if the Democratic candidate, whether it's Biden or anyone else, loses the Arab vote, I mean, that could be a problem, as well, since they're in that one particular state.
Now, these reports about the U.S. wanting this war to end by January, comes just a few days after the U.S. Defense Secretary told Israeli officials that, first of all, he said support for Israel is non-negotiable, but he warned them that Israel risks replacing a tactical victory with a strategic defeat if they don't do more to prevent civilian deaths. So it feels like it's at a snail pace, but the rhetoric is slowly changing, the U.S. For them to come out and publicly say these things, it's kind of unheard of before. Now, what I'm wondering is, and this is something I get asked a lot about, is what's going to happen? What is the U.S. actually going to take a stance? Because, as I just said a few minutes ago, Israel depends on U.S. support to conduct these kind of activities. What can the U.S. do? Will the U.S. do anything?
Well, again, it may just be rhetoric. I mean, just like the Arab leaders are strongly condemning Israel and then doing nothing to actually, help the Palestinians and maintaining their relations with Israel, like under the table. It could be that the Biden administration and U.S. officials are criticizing Israel for killing as many civilians as they are, just to cover their back and avoid criticism, within the U.S., while at the same time just keeping the bombs coming. And there was that report in the Wall Street Journal that came out last week that had talked about, I think it was like 55,000 artillery shells and 17,000 bombs, including a number of 2,000-pound bombs, massive bombs. And even in the Wall Street Journal, they mentioned that one of those bombings in the Jabalia refugee camp in Gaza had killed 100 people in just one strike. So again, as long as those bombs and munitions keep coming, and again, the U.S. has been redirecting munitions that were supposed to initially go to Ukraine. They've been redirecting those back towards Israel. So until we see the weapons, cut off, we have to assume, of course, it's just rhetoric on the part of the U.S. officials that claim or feign to be concerned about the civilian casualties.
Well, I have a different opinion. Because I think that what's happening in Ukraine is not like what's happening in Palestine, because the war on Ukraine affected the U.S. politically, and it shook its presence, its power in the world, but it didn't affect it directly as what's happening in Palestine. Because in Palestine, the U.S. officials said that around 76 bases or checkpoints for the U.S. in Iraq and Syria were hit. So this is, they are in the conflict directly. And of course, we should not forget what's happening in Yemen, because Yemen now officially you can say prevented Israeli ships or Israeli-linked ships to pass by Bab el-Mandab through the Red Sea. If ships is coming from China, from India, from Southeast Asia, can't pass through the traditional route. They have to go all the way to Africa, and this affects Israel, of course, but also it affects the U.S. because the U.S. since the 40s or the 50s, they are saying we are the guarantors of the waterways of this region of West Asia, and they use usually this pressure to keep the Arabian kings, like the Arabian king in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries, under their wing, because they say they tell them we are the power, we have the bases, we provide this security for your oil, and we will do everything to defeat your enemies. But what we are saying is that the poorest Arab country in Asia, which is Yemen, is doing this, and the U.S. can't counter it. Many people will argue, it's the U.S. wait, you'll see what they can do to Yemen, but these people don't know that Yemen is already in a state of war since 8 years, and it was being bombed constantly.
With NATO bombs.
Yeah, with NATO bombs and the U.S. logistics. So I think this is also will affect the U.S. I think the U.S. really wants to stop the war. And of course, when he said that they are redirecting bombs from Ukraine to Israel, and we know that the Ukrainian war is a planned war since 2014, and the U.S. was pushing Putin to invade Ukraine, and they planned for this, and also the official U.S. officials were clear that now their shift is against China. They want to redirect their navy and their usually hostility that usually was against the Soviet Union and Russia. They want to redirect it to China. But now this came suddenly, which surprised everybody. What's happening in Palestine. And now the US finds itself that I have to support Israel, but I can support it maybe in 2 months window. We have other plans that we already planned for in Ukraine and in China.
They've already warned Ukraine, they've warned the U.S. lawmakers that the money is running out. By the end of December, the money is running out. In Israel, they're saying by January you need to finish up with this war. Because which is one little thing I wanted to add. Because if we who is Biden running against? He's running against most likely Donald Trump. So there's also the possibility that Netanyahu is not interested in ending this war because he says, well, maybe it will be easier to deal with Trump in a year or so.
Netanyahu would definitely prefer to deal with Trump.
Interesting.
Yeah, so especially considering that they are saying this war is going to last at least a year. But actually, since we're talking about what is the end game here, for these different players, the U.S. has said what their end game is. And this is something I want to hear your thoughts on, Karim. Because what they have said is, we want the Palestinian Authority to rule Gaza. What do they call it? A revamped Palestinian Authority, whatever that means. And today Axios has a report that says that Israel now willing to discuss post-war Gaza with the U.S. officials, So, first of all, what is the likelihood of is the Palestinian Authority going to come into Gaza riding in the back of Israeli tanks? What is the likelihood of them coming in, and what is the likelihood of them even being accepted?
I think the current government of the U.S. is detached from reality because Hamas is not losing. After 2 months, they are not losing. And especially yesterday, the Hebrew media reported that yesterday's clashes in Gaza was the most fierce clashes. That tell us that Hamas is not being weakened. And the other faction also, yesterday they released videos because we know that in Gaza, not only Hamas is fighting, we have Jihad and we have other factions. And even the smaller factions are still fighting, and they are still firing missiles against Israel after 2 months. So I think if Israel is winning and Palestinians and Hamas is saying, please stop the war, stop the war, they might impose this on them. But in the current state, this is unrealistic. And of course, the Gazans, before Hamas, will not accept the PA to rule them, because we can see that even in West Bank, nobody likes the PA. And we see people, when they go to the streets to support Gaza, sorry to say it, but sometimes they forget Gaza and they start to curse the PA leader, which is Mahmoud Abbas.
I completely agree with what you said. This is just so detached from reality to say, oh no, we have a plan and it's going to be the Palestinian Authority, the one organization that for the past so many decades hasn't been able to achieve a single thing for the Palestinians. This is what's going to be running Gaza, So I think for them to say these things, for the U.S. to say these things, as if it's viable, it just goes to show you how little is actually being transmitted. How little factual information is coming out from occupied Palestine, to the rest of the world, because you see the news organizations talk about this as if it's viable, as if it's a viable plan. So this is definitely something that is going to continue to... So this is definitely something we're going to have to continue to talk about, especially as the weeks go on. And as January approaches, because, if the U.S. has set a deadline, it's going to be interesting how the Israelis respond, especially on the ground. For the Cradle News Roundup, my name is Esteban Carrillo. I have been joined by U.S. journalist William Bagwagenen and content creator and writer for The Cradle, Karim Shami. Make sure to follow us on X, on Instagram, on Telegram. Visit our website at thecradle.co. And if you feel generous, make sure to leave a donation on Patreon. Thank you so much for joining us, and see you next week.